welcome to the launch of Accommodating Biodiversity in Nordic Offshore Wind Projects, a new report from the Nordic Council of Ministers. My name is Marton Leander Wølstad, advisor and coordinator of this work at Nordic Energy Research, which is the cooperative platform for energy research and policy development under the auspices of the Nordic Council of Ministers, the official intergovernmental cooperation in the Nordic region. We have a vision to become the most integrated and sustainable region in the world by 2030. To achieve this, a massive build-out of renewable energy is needed, particularly in the North and Baltic seas. And in order for this infrastructure to be built in balance with nature, new methods are needed and new challenges need to be addressed for spatial planners. That is why earlier last year, the Nordic Council of Ministers commissioned a study to find good examples of coexistence between biodiversity and offshore wind farms. Fortunately, today we are launching the fruits of this work, and we are joined by our lead author, Marte Rusten, and a distinguished panel of experts who are leading international efforts to link energy and nature to accelerate the green transition across the world. So without further ado, let's find out just what this work is all about. It's really my pleasure to introduce our lead author for this study, Marte Rusten, Principal Consultant at DNV.
Thank you, Martin. And I'm really happy to be here at the launch to present this work that we have been doing on how to accommodate biodiversity in Nordic offshore wind projects. So I will give you a presentation of this work and the report now. So it has been a very interesting collaboration between Nordic Energy Research and DNV. At DNV, I would especially like to thank my co-author Eirik Færø Sæbø, which has been working closely with me on this project. So the aim has really been to identify key elements and recommended actions to accommodate biodiversity and stakeholder engagement in the Nordic region. And then to illustrate these key elements of existing practices through case studies. The process has been first to review lots of different literature and reports, and we've also had a very broad discussion with stakeholders representing offshore wind operators like Equinor, Vattenfall, Parkwind and Ørsted, manufacturers including Vestas, regulators, scientific institutions and also different NGOs, to try to really get a balanced picture of this. So first, some background on offshore wind energy and biodiversity. So we all know that biodiversity is under increasing pressure, and more than 1 million species, 1 out of 4, are at risk of extinction because of human activities. Both direct pressures and also indirect pressures like climate change. And for example, in the North Sea, seabird populations are declining and most of the commercial fish species are in endangered conditions. And in the Baltic Sea, even worse, where many species and habitats are in particularly poor condition because of eutrophication, pollution, overfishing, and trawling, to mention some factors. And of course, all of this affects the functionality of the ecosystem and their resilience towards additional pressures. And it's also a fact that biodiversity and climate change are tightly interconnected. So the loss of biodiversity aggravates climate change, and climate change intensifies biodiversity loss. And wind energy can help preserving biodiversity by reducing GHG emissions. So that is a very good thing, of course. And properly planned and designed projects can have a positive effect on nature conservation and restoration in local perspective, but also for sure, poorly sited or poorly designed wind farms can have negative impacts. So about the impact depends a lot of the concepts used and also the place where, of course, the installation is located. And by looking at the different types of concepts here, you see some bottom fixed here on the right and floating on the left, and evidently there will be a different impact on the environment when these are both installed and operated. And of course, the impact will differ if you have one turbine or if you have a lot of turbines in one area. And there will also be different impacts depending on the phase that you are in. Typically, offshore wind farm projects are developed in phases. First, you have a site characterization phase, often including baseline studies, for instance. You have the construction phase, where you are installing your foundation and have quite a lot of noise impacts. You have the operation phase, where you have impact from maintenance. And you have repowering, where you upgrade the turbines in an existing wind farm, also associated with activity at the site. Decommissioning, where you remove the wind farm and the turbines, and also end of life, where you dispose the turbine blades. As we have heard also, Martin said in the introduction, there will be the development of offshore wind will be a key factor to reach future energy demands and climate goals in an efficient way. And a lot of this will happen in Europe. And a 20-fold increase in Europe's offshore wind capacity is needed to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And the Nordic region will play a key role, where the North Sea can supply around 200 gigawatts and the Baltic Sea around 80 gigawatts by 2050. And this slide then shows the current situation of bottom fixed and floating offshore wind, which is either online, partly online, or under construction. And as you can see, most of the activity is located in Danish water. Some activity for floating wind is ongoing in Norway. We can see here with Hywind Tampen here, and also a research test center outside Karmøy, which is online. But really, the most experienced and a model for offshore wind in the Nordic is Denmark, which have and after that you have Sweden with approximately 10% of the Danish capacity, followed by Finland and Norway. But a lot of increase will take place, and this slide shows the estimated connected capacity in 2050. And you can see with the fold increase compared to current capacity here in red, and you can this clearly illustrate that there will be a massive increase in offshore wind developments in the area. And but these large expansions that are planned, of course, entail both challenges and opportunities. As I mentioned, there will be an additional pressure on the ecosystems, and there also there is a lack of baseline data, and also information on impacts and how to measure this. There will be a conflict for space with other sea users, and there will also be a complex stakeholder engagement processes. Because offshore wind are complex consortia with different partners in different project phases, and also with some that do not have offshore experience previously. But on the opportunity side, of course, more activity is happening, and the knowledge base is, of course, increasing. We also know that the abundance of wind energy allows for some flexibility when it comes to siting, especially for floating wind. And this opens opportunities for careful project siting, so it's possible to plan away from conflicts. There are also opportunities for coexistence between industries, and that is also something that could be a necessity when development proceeds. And there is potential for ecosystem restoration and ecosystem enhancements when projects are properly planned. And there is, of course, there is significant offshore experience in the area that it's important to leverage, and also to leverage existing collaboration frameworks in the Nordics will be important. So on the species population levels, the impacts can be beneficial. It can have no or balanced effect, or it can have negative impacts. I already mentioned an indirect positive effect that offshore wind, of course, can conserve biodiversity by reducing GHG emissions. The direct impacts can be physical changes with habitat loss or creation because of the foundations. And it can also be the foundations of the turbine can represent barriers, hindering species in their normal movement, and also represent collision risk for birds. It can alter the hydrodynamics in the surroundings, resulting from reduced wind speed in the wake of installations, for instance. And it can introduce some electromagnetic fields that can disturb certain species, but more research is needed to understand that better. And one very important aspect is of course, the cumulative impacts, which is the total impact arising from all activities, from all the industries in an area over time. So in this project, we have been studying how we can mitigate potential impacts of offshore wind development in a Nordic setting. And our work has been inspired by the mitigation hierarchy as described by the IUCN guidelines and also other places, where avoidance is the most important measures. And these are actions then taken to avoid impacts in the first place. And strategic planning is key in this phase. And the next step is, of course, to minimize impacts that we're not able to minimize. And examples of these can be then measures implemented during operation like noise reduction, etc. And then offsettings are measures taken to compensate for effects that it's not possible to handle by the steps already mentioned. This is not so much discussed in the Nordic, but it's applied in the UK, for instance, related to seabird. So when not able to minimize effects on seabirds, operators has been had to work to strengthen breeding colonies. This has been the case for Hornsea 3, for instance. And then the last is the restoration. So this is a process of reversing the degradation of ecosystems. So this can, of course, be incorporated in offshore wind projects to repair previous impacts from other activities. It has not had such high focus in the Nordic, but it's part of the licensing in the Netherlands, for instance. And of course, the guidelines also highlight the importance of good stakeholder engagement, and this is key both to identify and manage biodiversity risks and other conflict areas. So in our study, we have identified the following key elements to accommodate biodiversity. And it's about strategic planning. It's about collecting and sharing environmental data. It's about understanding cumulative impacts. And it's about underwater noise and stakeholder engagement. And the elements are, of course, different in nature and also overlapping. But we have then we have illustrated these key elements by 5 case studies that we had mapped in this slide. Not very precise maybe, but to different elements for which they could inspire good practice. And all are relevant for stakeholder engagements. So in the first case, which is the Danish process of opening areas for offshore wind, describe how the Danish government work with opening areas for offshore wind with avoidance as the main mitigation action, accommodating both biodiversity and stakeholders. So the process starts with a general study to identify no-go areas, and then continues with a more fine screening process for identifying location with the best conditions for energy production with the least conflict with other sea users and the environment. And the Danish government aim at efficient processes by establishing a one-stop shop for offshore wind. And we find that the case is relevant for the other Nordic governments to inspire efficient and predictable low-risk process for different stakeholders. And the Danish system removes risk from the operator and might be more suitable when assessing smaller sea areas. The second case that we have chosen is from the Hywind Scotland Park project, which is a good example of project-specific avoidance by microsite characterization. So in Scotland, operators take more responsibility for the hands-on siting process than in Denmark, for instance. And the case describes how the operator, Equinor, evaluated different locations within an assigned area by performing detailed mapping to allow for optimal siting of a floating offshore wind project in terms of both environmental and technical aspects. The third case is about coordinated environmental monitoring. So, of course, to be able to perform effective mitigation of project impacts, it requires a thorough understanding of the biodiversity in an area as a baseline, and also potential changes over time as a result of offshore wind installations. And this is acquired by environmental monitoring. And two examples from governmental-led operators paid coordinated environmental monitoring is from Belgium, offshore wind development in Belgium, and the oil and gas industry in Norway. These examples has proven to be efficient use both of time and resources to build trust and transparency of accumulated knowledge and facilitate stakeholder dialogue. So all data collected here are publicly available. And the fourth case is on cumulative impacts. And of course, it's a key challenge for development of offshore wind in the Nordics and also other places to understand how effects accumulate. What are the ecological thresholds and when are they exceeded? And to learn more about this, research is needed and it's also ongoing. And one example from Norway is the MARSIS 2021-2025 project with the focus on seabirds, funded by the Research Council of Norway. Another example is the Scottish Government research project called Cumulative Effects Framework for Key Ecological Receptors, CEF, focusing on both seabirds and marine mammals. So both of these research programs will develop methods to facilitate a robust assessment of cumulative effects using a consistent and transparent approach. And the last case study is about noise mitigation by bubble curtain, which is the most operational case that we have chosen. But it's chosen because efforts are really needed to reduce underwater noise. And this is considered to be the most acute impact of offshore wind development. And bubble curtains are a proven technology for this purpose. And the report then covers an evaluation of this methodology. So to conclude, there are large planned expansions in the Nordic, and this entails both challenges and opportunities. There is significant offshore experience to build up upon in the area, but it's important to leverage existing Nordic frameworks for data collections and cumulative impact assessments. It's also important to establish dialogue and multinational processes for marine spatial planning at sea basin scales to understand and accommodate biodiversity and stakeholders. For more details, should I read the report also? Thank you.
Thank you, Marte, for that very thorough run-through. And indeed, there are some exciting and inspiring examples for accommodating biodiversity around the Nordic region and our neighbor countries. And we strongly encourage everyone in the audience to check out the report on the Nordic Energy Research website or the norden.org publication portal. Now, we move ahead in our program. We're going to see a few videos from some of the other efforts around the world that are working to link energy and nature. And after that, we'll open up for an exciting panel discussion. So stick with us.
A race for ocean space is underway, one shaped by humanity's pressing need for sustainable food and energy, and made possible by technological innovation. DNV forecasts demand for ocean space will grow ninefold by the middle of the century, driven by the rapid growth of offshore wind and marine aquaculture. The energy transition will alter much about the blue economy. Currently, 80% of capital expenditure comes for the oil and gas sector. But by the middle of the century, offshore wind will be responsible for half of capex, and oil and gas will account for just 25%. Regions that were not part of the age of fossil fuel can be part of the age of wind. Greater China is building out its offshore wind infrastructure, and by the middle of the century, it will be the powerhouse of the blue economy, accounting for more than a quarter of global capex investment. DNV has mapped the stretches of coastline which have the potential for offshore growth, but also need the most careful management. In this sample stretch of coast in China, the areas in orange and red will experience the greatest spatial competition. Demand for space needs to be closely managed to avoid conflict between industries and to protect delicate ecosystems.
Our team of marine biologists, we were doing this shoreline survey on the west coast of Norway, typically in an area where customers want to build wind farms. All of a sudden we were surrounded by pilot whales that were playing in the ocean. Later in the same area, we were filming deep-water coral gardens that were teeming with life. Ocean wind is a vital part of the energy transition, but we need to make sure that we have the appropriate controls in place so that we can manage the impact that we have on the ecosystems.
There is a need for climate-smart marine spatial planning, taking into account data on biodiversity, so we can preserve and enhance the natural ecosystems we depend upon. Learn more about the services we deliver to achieve integrated ocean planning.
Our world is in the midst of a climate and nature crisis. To help solve it, we need to rapidly transform our global energy system from one reliant on fossil fuels to one powered by renewable energy. At the same time, we need to stop destroying nature and rather protect and restore it. Although clean energy is vital to reduce emissions and protect people and nature from a warmer world, new renewable energy projects can also have an unintended impact on biodiversity. But the much needed change in our energy system must not happen at nature's expense. We've spent a century building an energy system that is based on fossil fuels, and we have around a decade to change that. A lot of renewable energy needs to be built quickly. The Coalition of Energy and Nature for Action has been created by 6 founding organizations to bring together all those aware of the effect of energy on nature. Together, we can find the best solution and highlight the need for new renewable energy projects to be carefully assessed for their impact on the natural world. Clean Action aims to ensure that the options that cause the least damage to nature are prioritized. Wind and solar energy take up a lot of space which may already be important for biodiversity. With careful planning, wind farms and solar facilities can be integrated into landscapes with lower ecological value. To drive forward a nature-positive energy revolution, we must ensure that the Earth's most sensitive locations are avoided, and the impact on nature is transparently declared and monitored. All of us need to collaborate to consider nature in future energy plans. Those involved with delivering enough renewable energy to meet our global climate ambitions must hear the messages from those that understand the impact on nature. We can't afford any further decline in biodiversity from fossil fuels and the consequences this has for lives and livelihoods. We must all work together and learn from each other to reach the best solutions. Join us at Clean Action. Let's work together with people and nature for a cleaner world.
Hi, Martin, and the rest of the participants. I'm Joe Kiesecker with the Nature Conservancy. I appreciate the opportunity to provide some input into the conversations today. Sorry I couldn't be there live, but it's the middle of the night for me. So hopefully I am sound asleep right now. If you don't know who we are, the Nature Conservancy is one of the largest global environmental nonprofits with programs in around 7 countries around the world. We're working to create a world where people and nature can thrive. As a lead scientist, I spend the bulk of my time leading a strategy that we call development by design that seeks to address some of the fundamental flaws in development planning and permitting. Right now, we don't think about impact mitigation until a project is proposed. When it comes to reducing conflicts and mitigating impacts to biodiversity from development, we spend a disproportionate amount of our resources working reactively at the site or project level. We need to shift to phases that are early in the planning process and at larger spatial scales. With development by design, we seek to invert that process, focus on cumulative impacts, improve conservation outcomes, and in some cases provide more certainty around development permitting. We work on a diversity of footprints, from ag to energy, mining, and urban expansion, with work on land, freshwater, and marine. And we partner with governments, companies, and lending institutions. With climate change as a defining issue of the century, we're adapting our development by design approach to address this challenge. TNC has 3 main focal areas towards tackling climate change: improving policy commitments, natural climate solutions work, and renewable energy siting solutions. The latter is critical given that around 75% of our emissions come from energy. So we need a rapid overhaul of our energy systems away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. The reality is that the renewable energy transition is going to have many challenges. We've spent over a century building an energy system based on fossil fuels, and we have a decade or 2 to shift towards renewable energy. In turn, we have a lot of renewable energy to build, upwards of 20 times of our current installed capacity. And the reality is that the leading forms of renewable energy, wind and solar, take a lot of space in comparison to fossil fuels. Potential for land use conflicts is high, and those conflicts may slow the transition. We already see conflict in the renewable energy that's been built. Conflicts over renewable energy and the environment and social issues are featured on the front pages of newspapers on a regular basis. And there are studies that are showing that ignoring those environmental and social issues can result in delays and higher costs. In some cases, significant delays and cost overruns. Right now, the conservation community is comfortable with telling governments and industry where they shouldn't develop renewable energy, but we need to work cooperatively to use our data and convening power to ID renewable energy go areas if we want to see the rapid transition that's needed. TNC is targeting the highest emitting countries and regions, so US, India, China, and Europe, building tools that let government and industry screen projects for risk, and at the same time use those values to design go areas to meet renewable energy targets. Given the scale of the challenge and the limited time, we need an energy revolution. And that's why we're partnering with groups like Clean Action with the hope of synchronizing government, researchers, and civil society around this critical issue. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here today, and back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Joe, for coming to us from Colorado with that important message about development by design from the Nature Conservancy. Well, we're joined by a panel today, a panel of distinguished experts, I might add. Allow me to introduce them. We have Rachel Asante-Uso, Manager of the Global Business and Biodiversity Program at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. Thanks for joining us, Rachel. We have Jan Willem van Bocheve, Senior Principal Consultant at the Biodiversity Consultancy. Good to see you, Jan Willem. Dean Cooper, Global Lead for the Energy Transition at the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Thanks for joining us. Tris Allenson, Senior Global Science Officer at BirdLife. Thanks for being here. Miao Hong, Director of the Sustainable Invest Program at the World Resources Institute, China. Good to have you with us. And of course, Marte Rusten, our lead author from DNV. Well, let's get started. I'd like to go to you first, Jan Willem. Now, on behalf of the Biodiversity Consultancy, you co-authored the IUCN guidelines on mitigating biodiversity impacts associated with solar and wind energy development. And the chapter on offshore wind energy is particularly relevant for the Nordics. Could you walk us through some of the unique challenges for monitoring and mitigating biodiversity impacts in a Nordic context versus some emerging markets?
Thanks very much, Martin. It's a pleasure to be here, and really enjoyed the introduction to the guidelines. They're a real valuable addition to the ongoing efforts to try and understand impacts and mitigation opportunities for offshore and other renewable energy development. So it's really great. Yeah, the guidelines that we produced together with IUCN on mitigating biodiversity impacts from wind and solar, focus on the much wider range of risks and opportunities beyond offshore, to also look at onshore and also look at solar. And of course, the geographic scope is much wider as well. So we've pulled out a number of case studies that we thought would be useful to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities for offshore wind. I think one of the key differences is the information that you have for understanding where you might be able to place offshore wind farms in the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea in areas to ideally, avoid and minimize impacts as far as possible. Such biodiversity data is often not available, at least not to the same extent, in much of the emerging market areas. And so there's a real risk there that you end up pursuing offshore wind expansion into areas where it turns out there are actually significant issues that were underestimated or simply overseen early on in development. So the really important thing for offshore wind development everywhere, but I would argue particularly in areas of lower, where there's less information, is to ensure that you work very carefully with stakeholders and with conservation specialists and experts early on to compile the evidence that is available and try and generate a good understanding of potential sensitivities. And there's mechanisms and procedures to undertake that, but often it involves wide stakeholder engagement. Very early on, we see many cases of wind developments that are occurring, or decisions that are being made at a time when really it becomes too late to actually change the planning and siting of these developments, when really big impacts, significant impacts to, for example, migratory birds could have been avoided if only there was some more early attention to placement of wind farms along migratory flyways for birds, for example. So that is a key challenge that we are seeing for much of the offshore wind development in emerging markets. There's always a data challenge, but I think in practice, engaging the right stakeholders early on and working with them, you can find that actually there is good existing knowledge which can be pulled together to understand where opportunities are to place wind farms away from sensitive areas. I think that would be my kind of take-home message here: is stakeholder engagement is essential, as your report highlights as well.
Thank you, Jan Willem. Absolutely, stakeholder engagement is critical, and I think we're learning this as we go along in the Nordic region as well. Now, our report also highlights some of the opportunities associated with habitat enhancement and offsets. Now, what are some of these offset opportunities above and below water? How can they be measured, and what are some of the pilot and demo approaches to showing them?
Yeah, there's definitely opportunities to offset residual impacts from offshore wind farms. But before we discuss those, I think it's worth reiterating the importance of early avoidance over and above any other measures that look at restorative actions and offsetting and compensation action. So, as the report highlights, avoidance is key, and so early planning for marine offshore wind farms through marine spatial planning and strategic assessment and sensitivity mapping and all those tools that are out there is essential to really minimize the risk and liability associated with having to implement uncertain and often costly offsetting measures. But where those residual impacts are unavoidable, and often that is the case, there will be a level of residual impact that needs to be addressed. There are opportunities for habitat enhancement around offshore wind turbine foundations, and there's some good case studies there that show that you can restore oyster beds or reef structures around offshore wind farms. That often has the added benefit as well, is that it excludes fishing, which is in itself, often a contentious issue with stakeholders. But the fact remains that by excluding fishing from an offshore wind farm, you're effectively creating a de facto marine reserve. And there's evidence to show that when that happens, you can see a rebounding of fish stocks and associated habitat that supports those fish stocks. So there can be benefits not just for biodiversity, but also to surrounding fisheries. Addressing the impacts above the water, predominantly associated with impacts to birds and bats, is challenging. And our perception is that it really requires a holistic approach. You need to work at wider scales with multiple developers to understand and be able to attribute different impacts towards different wind farms. And I think the only really feasible way to address those through offsets is to look at establishing protected areas elsewhere that address some of the other threats being faced by those species beyond the collision impact from the wind turbine. So you could look at enhancing protection of important colonies, breeding colonies of those birds, looking at policy changes such as ways to reduce bycatch from fisheries through long lining, for example, or measures to reduce collision risk for cetaceans. But offsets are challenging. There's still a lot of unknowns for the marine environment. It was mentioned before, things like noise we know it's an impact, but there's not all that much known about the long-term effects of noise. And noise impacts are difficult to address entirely. And if there are long-term effects, then you need to look at ways that you can improve the populations and lifespan and reproductive success of cetaceans, of whales and dolphins elsewhere by, again, establishing protected areas. But there's no simple solutions, and it really requires careful management and coordination between developers, government agencies, and the conservation sector to identify appropriate offsetting measures.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned, Jan Willem, the importance of early risk screening and sensitivity mapping tools. Now, Tris, BirdLife is pioneering several sensitivity mapping tools like Soaring Bird and AviStep. Could you tell us, why is it important that these tools complement rather than replace environmental impact assessments on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and good morning, everyone. Obviously, it's essential that we transition to renewable energy. Nevertheless, and as Joe made clear in his video, wind and solar are space intensive and will require many millions of hectares of land and sea globally for us to meet our renewable energy targets. The good thing about wind and solar is that these are widespread resources, so much of the Earth's surface is sufficiently windy and sunny to allow us to generate energy. So it really is key to avoiding conflict between renewable energy and wildlife is good spatial planning that enables us to identify ecologically sensitive areas and avoid them. And it's really encouraging to see the emphasis the report being launched today places on strategic spatial planning. Sensitivity maps, which identify areas of potential ecological conflict, are a really key strategic planning tool, and I think should be seen as an essential precursor to any large-scale renewable energy development. Now, they don't negate the need for more detailed site assessment, in the same way that wind developers will begin when prospecting for wind by looking at maps of wind resource to initially identify areas that appear suitably windy, but then go on to confirm this by installing meteorological instruments at a site. So sensitivity maps provide an initial assessment that must then be followed up by detailed on-site environmental impact assessment. But ultimately, whilst environmental impact assessments will always provide a more accurate assessment of a site, they can't tell you anything about the relative importance of that site in relation to the wider land or seascape, which is why sensitivity mapping is so important.
What would be some of the unique challenges to sensitivity mapping in an offshore environment specifically?
Yeah, so I think it's true to say that developing sensitivity maps for offshore wind is harder, primarily because we frequently don't have the same quality of data on the distribution of sensitive species at sea as we do on land. It's also likely to be the case that the distribution of species at sea is more ephemeral than on land. So areas that are key foraging sites for seabirds or for cetaceans may vary more from year to year than where key habitats on land. So I think it is more difficult to create such maps. Yet many sensitive maps have been developed for offshore environments, and I think it's no less important to develop these maps. And it's worth remembering that even relatively crude maps can be extremely helpful in assisting good site selection.
Thank you, Tris. Now, also, BirdLife coordinates the Convention on Migratory Species Energy Task Force, which we mentioned stakeholder consultation earlier. This task force includes governments, investors, scientists, businesses, civil society, NGOs. What's the purpose of a forum like this, and what benefits do you see from this type of consultation?
Yeah, so in 2014, the world's governments that are signatories to the Convention on Migratory Species, so CMS being an environmental treaty under the aegis of the United Nations, these governments agreed to establish a multi-stakeholder task force with representatives, as you say, from government, multilateral environmental agreements, investors, the private sector, and NGOs. And the main aim of this group is to establish global best practice on wildlife-safe renewable energy and to develop the kind of tools and knowledge needed to ensure a truly green, clean energy revolution. So, for example, we're about to launch some best practice guidelines on post-construction fatality monitoring. It's incredibly important to understand the impact that that wind facilities have, and that's why post-construction monitoring is so important. But really, for that data to be as useful as it can, we need people around the world to be collecting that data in standardized and comparable methods. And we've developed an approach and guidance that will enable that, particularly across emerging markets around the world. And as you say, and as one of the things that's been highlighted, and is I really would agree throughout, is that this kind of collaboration, which brings together stakeholders from conservation, government, and the energy sector, all with a common aim of ensuring nature-safe renewable energy expansion, is, I think, the most important way to ensure that we can both meet our renewable energy targets and our biodiversity commitments. And I would, use this opportunity to urge governments and energy developers to establish collaborations with conservationists. This, shouldn't be an area where these groups are in conflict, but rather one where we're working in unison. We should all want to see renewable energy expanded. We should all want to ensure that it's not achieved at the expense of biodiversity. So to add to other voices that have said, collaboration and stakeholder engagement is really critical.
Absolutely. Shifting gears, Rachel, it's no secret, especially considering recent developments, that energy supply chains are vulnerable. And while renewables are part of the solution, we know that wind turbines, for example, rely heavily on rare earth elements that need to be mined somewhere around the world. And right now, it's not clear whether supply can meet the enormous demand that we will see for this type of infrastructure. Now, I know that IUCN is looking into this, but are wind developers looking sufficiently into their supply chains? And are they taking the right precautions in terms of responsible sourcing and also security?
So first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for allowing me to be here, and it's been a real pleasure. As you said, there are going to be issues around sourcing of raw materials for the renewable energy sector. I've been listening to the presentations so far, and one of the things that I found most heartening was the ambition from the Nordic region to scale up their renewable energy supply and renewable energy generation. In addition, I'd like to say that if we're going to meet the Paris climate goals, we're going to have to ramp up renewable energy globally. And this is going to mean we're going to need more solar, we're going to need more onshore and offshore wind. And this is also going to lead to the need for more raw materials, more metals, more copper, more bauxite, more rare earths, as you've mentioned, Morten. And what we're already seeing now is more competition for these materials. I should say that the most efficient way to meet this greater demand for raw materials is through recycling. And I know that within the renewable energy sector, there's been significant recycling around aluminium and around steel. But suffice to say, it's clear that new mining is going to be necessary, and we're already seeing new mines being developed linked to the renewable energy sector. If these mines and this raw material generation and extraction is not managed responsibly, then, as many have already said, there is a real danger that the renewable energy sector and the renewable energy generation that we need so badly to combat climate change could end up having adverse impacts on biodiversity and on society as a whole. I think, to answer your question, that there are some really good practices happening now in terms of responsible sourcing. But as I've said, this need for more renewable energy is going to require more companies coming into the market. And it's important that we are able to highlight this good practice in responsible sourcing globally, and that we are able to make sure that regulators around the world also understand and require responsible sourcing as part of their plans for renewable energy generation. I know that in the EU, as part of their strategic outlook on how they increase the renewable energy generation within the region, they're also looking at how they can ensure that there are no, or that they reduce the negative impacts on environment and societies outside of the EU. And one of those main ways of doing that is to look at how they can help ensure responsible sourcing of renewable energy parts and renewable energy generated requirements within the EU. We look at the world today and we see that the world is not static, and any responsible sourcing strategies have to be adaptive. They have to be nimble, they have to be adaptive, and they have to learn and have continuous learning embedded in them. And so that's another thing that I would say is being proved to be critical as we move into this phase of ramping up renewable energy generation.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned that regulators will play a critical role also in facilitating these learning processes. But what exactly can companies do to make their supply chains more visible? And what is IUCN doing here specifically?
So there are tools, there are standards that that companies can use to ensure that their supply chain is using responsible sourcing methods and methodologies in order to gain not just the raw materials, but also the tool parts or the turbines that may be needed for wind and offshore wind energy generation. I think if there's one appeal I can make, it is that we need to have more information sharing about what it takes to have good practice in responsible sourcing. As I said previously to you, Martin, there are some companies that are really doing and implementing best practice in this area. And what IUCN intends to do as part of our Renewables Phase 2 project is to work with those companies, also to work with our state members and our NGO members in order to be able to highlight different frameworks and different tools that can be used to support responsible sourcing, and also to highlight the risks and the opportunities that that exist in different tools like third-party verification and certification. So we'll be working with our members and with the renewable energy sector, really to see how we can provide that guidance, not just for regulators, but also for new companies that are going to come into the renewable energy sector globally. And I'm happy to say we'll be working with TBC and our NGO members on this as well.
Absolutely. And I think this highlights also the importance of the private sector and even the financial sector. Now, Miao, we know that the financial sector plays a critical role in advancing the green transition. And we also know that the World Resources Institute has initiated the Partnership of Biodiversity and Finance, PBF, to advance the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals and also the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Could you tell us how PBF plans to achieve this goal?
Thank you, Martin, and thank you for just invite me to participate in this panel discussion. I think as an international cooperation initiative on biodiversity, after COP15 Phase 1, the partnership of this biodiversity and finance with a broader stakeholders, including governments, financial institutes, companies, and civil societies, is to enhance the international cooperation focused on nexus between biodiversity and the finance market. I think PBF wanted or plans to achieve this goal from following maybe 5 aspects. And first of all, say integrating biodiversity conservation into financial institutes, services, business strategies, decision-making process, and policies. Actually, IFI are under this PBF, IFIs are encouraged to work with biodiversity groups to develop more tools, models, and products to mobilize more finance resources in support of biodiversity conservation practices. So that's the first aspect. And secondly, under PBF is by creating an enabling investment environment, to encourage enterprises and investors to disclose biodiversity-related financial risks, I think, and also encouraging private investment activities to be in compliance with the requirements for the upcoming post-2020 by the Global Biodiversity Framework. I think it's a second aspect. Thirdly, by formulating the guidance to coordinate and integrate different finance products and the technical tools developed by stakeholders. I think that's the third aspect. Fourthly, by building a platform and increase collaboration among the environment organizations on shared biodiversity risk data and as well as a practice of biodiversity conservation in infrastructure development and also investments. Finally, say by enhancing the leading roles of multilateral development banks, or we call it MDBs, to demonstrate ESG practice and supporting capacity building in order to avoid transferring biodiversity risks to less developed countries and regions and meet the needs of future responsible investment activities.
Thank you very much. Well, it's certainly interesting and important to see how biodiversity risk can be integrated into infrastructure investments. And I think that will only become more important moving forward. I'd like to pan over to Dean. Now at WWF, you're also focusing on the link between energy and nature. And I'm wondering if you could explain to us just exactly why this is significant and how exactly you plan to address this through clean action.
Thanks very much, Martin. It's great to speak to you and the other panelists. And I think my overriding impression from is that there's a lot going on out there, and a lot of people realizing that this link between energy and nature needs to be addressed. The question for us has been, since I've been looking at this area from a WWF perspective, internally within our organization and externally, there are lots of initiatives addressing this issue, but a lot of it is acting independently. And we're all doing our own thing. We're often doing it very well, but often not really linking up with others and taking account of what else is happening. So we felt for a while that we could have much more impact if we could bring all of this together, all of these efforts and good motivations, the sort of messages that you've already heard earlier today, and try to see how we can share this knowledge and experience and maximize the impact, because we do need to address this issue. It's important, it's an urgent issue, and it needs to be done now. I think there's been a lot of talking, and that's something that we're trying to address. It's not just the motivations, the intentions, but rather to say, look, let's do something. Let's take some real action. So it was on that basis that we said, look, let's try to bring together all of those working in energy and the energy transition. Obviously, it's a high global profile at the moment. This idea that we really need to move by 2030, we've got to get away from fossil fuels. We really have to use this decade to bring in renewable energy, but also to address the people on the nature side who recognize that, in fact, while renewable energy is the best option, certainly better than fossil fuels, the alternatives, there are issues. And we have to be careful that when we are introducing new forms of renewable energy, we do so carefully. I remember when I first joined WWF, one of my first, the first reports I read was an assessment of the biodiversity loss over 50 years from 1970 to 2020, so the recent history. And we've lost like 68% of wildlife species in that time. I mean, that for me is frightening. And I think it's something that we have to take into account. For a lot of people who understand these issues, like those on the call on the panel today, great to hear from the other organizations who are pushing this whole agenda. And we felt that it was time now to try to bring this together so we can form a partnership of energy organizations and nature-based organizations, and have a coalition which is linking energy and nature, but not just to talk about the issues, but to take some action. So that's the basis of clean action. So the coalition linking energy and nature for action. And we're welcoming now all partners involved with energy activity and nature-based activity to join us. And as I say, work together, benefit from the experience that's already out there, the knowledge that we can share, and connect with other organizations that can complement your own work and activities. I can go on and give you more details, Martin, but I don't want to to bore you with that if not needed. So please let me know.
Well, I'm curious about other energy and nature related issues that you feel should be prioritized, and specifically what WWF is doing about it.
Sure, yeah. Well, this is one of the big challenges that we have, is to try to understand what are the main routes, what are the best routes for renewable energy applications. So we have at WWF a number of different departments looking at different areas. I'm based in the climate and energy, the global practice which deals with climate and energy. When I speak to my colleagues in freshwater, they say, well, this hydropower is really just terrible for our rivers, the fish, the occupation of the rivers, the free flowing. We really must avoid hydropower. If I speak to my colleagues in our oceans department, they'll say this deep sea mining that we need for all these minerals, if we're looking for cobalt or nickel or copper or manganese, all these things for batteries and appliances and generation for renewable energy, it's just destroying our oceans. We really can't afford to get involved in this area. I speak to forests. The people in the forest department, they tell me wind really is not a great solution. Look at the bird life issues. We've heard from BirdLife International. How can we manage this? And even solar power, I mean, it needs a lot of land to bring in the number of PV applications, the photovoltaics that we need for this. That's land use. I mean, this is alternative sources of use for land, for food particularly. We just bear in mind all of these different issues. So it's really a question of trying to say, yes, we understand these issues. We've got to take them into account, and really to say to our energy developers, our colleagues in the energy sector, that this is an issue they need to be aware of. So we're not just saying, yes, we want lots more renewable energy. Of course, we do want lots more renewable energy, but it needs to be done in the right way, and being aware of some of these issues that will impact on nature if we're not careful taking this forward. This is a one chance we have to get in the right direction. We can do it. And one of the other parts that Clean Action has been involved in, as I said earlier, is not just to talk about these issues, but to say, look, what can we do? And you'll have heard from the other speakers, one of the issues that has been raised as a priority option is to look at spatial mapping. So we've tried to go down that route and say, look, from a global perspective, where is the best place for us to site wind power systems and solar systems? Are there areas that we really should be avoiding? Can we provide the world's needs in the areas that won't cause that sort of disruption? And if I were just completing now a global map of this process, we're hoping to put that in a report and launch that within the next few weeks, together with the Biodiversity Consultancy, Jan Willem, you heard from earlier, and obviously input from all the clean action partners. So we're hoping that will be our first activity, which we can show some practical opportunities to try to direct the development of renewable energy in a few years.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to getting a hold of that report. So please do let us know when it's available. I would like to pan over to Marte to hear your thoughts on some of the perspectives that have been shared in this panel discussion. And also, we just mentioned the importance of spatial mapping and cross-sectoral collaboration as a tool to ensure good spatial mapping practices. Now, based on our Nordic examples and examples from neighbor countries, would you agree that this sort of cross-sectoral collaboration is really crucial to identifying risks as well as opportunities regarding the use of the sea space?
Of course, that is really, I think, a key topic to understand how, to understand the cumulative impacts of activities from different industries and how they overlap with environmental values over time. I think that is critical, and to ensure good collaboration between on sea basin scales, really, because species and impacts do not understand boundaries between countries. So I think that is really critical. And also, especially moving forward now with all the developments planned, it will be key to have good tools to understand and to visualize such impacts, and also for communication with stakeholders.
And how do you think these stakeholders should get together to make sure that the right tools are being used in the right places? What are those specific considerations in a Nordic context?
No, I think that there are some good examples from stakeholder interaction, and it's key to engage at an early stage, and it's key to understand everyone's concerns and interests, and maybe to plan monitoring activities and agree on acceptance criteria for impact, for instance, and also to ensure a coordinated process then from an early stage.
Just to take the Netherlands as an example, there it's actually a requirement in the offshore wind farm licensing process that this type of infrastructure includes some sort of nature enhancing solution. Do you think that something similar could be achieved in the Nordics?
So I think it's an interesting, of course, opportunity, but I think that site-specific considerations are important. Of course, the activities as they do in the Netherlands, for instance, it's about restoring, it's about reintroducing the oyster beds that was there and has been destroyed by trawling activities. So the activities there is really focused on reintroducing a species that was there before, but that has been extinguished. So I think that sites, you have to understand the biodiversity or the ecosystem where you are placing the installation and identify what would be the best solution based on that. Of course, if you introduce some hard substrates in soft bottom environments, of course you will have a lot of it will be an artificial reef effect that will change the environment, but we don't really know so much about how that will the effects of that. So I think that you need a better understanding of that first before you introduce more components to it. But it's definitely an interesting opportunity that should be looked into.
Absolutely. It sounds like an area that we should be looking into. It seems clear to me from what I've heard today that it's crucial to get all the relevant stakeholders involved so that a site-specific approach is followed. before new offshore wind farms are tendered. Unfortunately, we are running out of time today, and it's been a real pleasure to hear from all of our panelists, and I strongly encourage our audience to check out the report and also the initiatives going on all around the world that we've heard about from our panel today. So thank you for joining us, and bye for now.